Thank you, Amy, for the very kind introduction, and thank you also to your colleagues in both European paintings as well as education for so generously welcoming me to the Nelson-Atkins and to Kansas City. And congratulations on a beautiful installation, Amy, and if you have not yet seen the exhibition, I urge you all to go see it. Just not right now, but soon. Okay, so on to the matter at hand. François Gérard came of age as an artist during the heady days that followed the Revolution of 1789. Trained in the studio of the leading history painter of the day, Jacques-Louis David, the young artist, seen here in an informal portrait painted in 1790 by his friend and fellow student, Antoine-Jean Gros, aspired to follow in the footsteps of his master. He made his debut at the Paris Salon in 1791 with an unremarkable history painting in the tradition of David. 4 years later, he had his breakthrough moment with a painting of the blind Byzantine general Belisarius. That work is known today through this replica, which was painted in 1797. By the way, this particular painting was a bold move on Gérard's part, as David had painted the same subject in 1781. So it's as if, Gérard is saying to his teacher, I can do you and do you one better. A survey of contemporary French art, published in 1801, declared that Gérard earned the title of history painter with his Belisarius, which was deemed, and I quote, one of the most beautiful paintings of the French school. Such praise aside, as the 18th century drew to a close, Gérard focused increasingly on portraiture. This magisterial portrait of the artist Jean-Baptiste Isabey and his daughter descending the steps of the Louvre elicited comparisons to the work of the 17th century Flemish master Antony van Dyck when it was shown at the Salon in 1796. And by the way, at the time, the Louvre was where the artists like Gérard and David had their studios. Other portraits soon followed. But it was the success of this portrait of a languidly posed Josephine Bonaparte, wife of First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte, that was hailed as a masterpiece at the Salon of 1801. And this work and its success established Gérard as the preferred portraitist of the elite. His popularity was due in no small part to flatter his illustrious sitters. As an 18th century commentator observed, the most successful portraitists in the eyes of the public were those who possessed, and I quote, the art of flattering their models with enough skill to persuade them that they were not flattering them at all. Idealization was an intrinsic aspect of a portraitist's art, as reactions to Gérard's portrait of Josephine Bonaparte attest. One of the sitter's friends admired, quote, the art with which Gérard had made her look younger without spoiling her likeness. Well, don't we all want that? While another contemporary warned that, quote, it is wrong to see the portrait before having been in the presence of Madame Bonaparte. You are bound to be disappointed. Gérard's ascent as a portraitist coincided with Bonaparte's rapid rise to power, and he soon established himself as the go-to portraitist of the Bonaparte family. Between 1801 and 1814, Gérard painted portraits of 4 of Bonaparte's 7 siblings, his mother, his 2 wives, and various members of his extended family, recording the new imperial dynasty for posterity. And if, like me, you grew up watching American TV in the 1970s, the Bonaparte clan might well recall a certain sitcom family dynasty of the era. I mean, there were just so many of them. Anyway, there you go. In 1802, Gérard painted this portrait of Bonaparte's youngest sister, Caroline, who 2 years earlier, at the age of 18, had married General Joachim Murat, one of the most brilliant officers in her brother's army. She emanates maternal tenderness in this intimate family portrait, a modern Madonna, flanked by the couple's oldest son and their newborn daughter. So that little one in the cradle, you'll see her in the exhibition as the little girl who looks to be absconding with a portrait bust of Napoleon in a painting by Madame Chaudet. This work is the first of 5 portraits that Gérard would paint of Caroline Murat. Around the same time, he also portrayed her husband in a portrait that attests to the ambitions of both artist and sitter. Fresh from his triumphs with Bonaparte on the battlefield in Italy, Murat appears in the uniform of a commander of the consular guard, thereby signaling his loyalty to his new brother-in-law, First Consul Bonaparte. He is attended rather ostentatiously by a young page who hands him his hat. But I'm sure the more astute observers would have realized that that compositional device was possibly an allusion to the aristocratic portraiture of Anthony van Dyck and also royal portraits from the 17th century. So Murat was both vain and ambitious. The effect of the whole is intentionally ostentatious, as a savvy contemporary commentator observed. This work, among Gérard's earliest full-length portraits, also showcases his technical mastery. An ex-radiograph reveals that he made few changes as he worked, and note in particular his attention to the details of the elaborate uniform and the modeling of the sitter's handsome features. Gérard exhibited this life-size portrait in the Salon of 1802, doubtless with an eye to advancing his own reputation as well as that of his sitter. After the Salon closed, he displayed the work in his studio, along with a portrait of Bonaparte's rival, General Moreau. So as if at this point, Gérard didn't want to be seen to take sides just in case things ended up going in a different direction. At the same time, Gérard's portrait of Murat was widely admired for its vigor and extraordinary color. Interestingly, this glamorous power couple never posed together for Gérard. Their portraits highlight Gérard's range and versatility as a portraitist, a skill that served him well throughout his career. A contemporary of the artist said that, quote, "The men of that era believed themselves illustrious and the women beautiful only inasmuch as Gérard's brush had assured their immortality." Reinforcing that sentiment, Murat again turned to Gérard to commemorate his continued ascent after Napoleon named him Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Murat wears the full uniform of the rank, and note in particular the red chain, the gold chain and the red sash of the Legion of Honor, which was an order of merit that Napoleon had created in 1802 while still First Consul. And of course, that order still exists today. Murat's aristocratic pose belies the fact that he was the son of an innkeeper. So that is a little sign of and a reminder of the very potent power of images. It's all in the packaging, right? On December 2nd, 1804, Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French in a lavish ceremony at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. To that point, I show you the ultimate dynastic statement in the form of David's monumental depiction of the imperial coronation ceremony. It is both history painting and family portrait, with the Bonaparte bunch prominently featured. Here they all are. And over here, I just want to point out Talleyrand, because I'll be talking about him in a bit. And meanwhile, almost dead center is Napoleon's mother. And you might think, oh, of course it makes sense. She's the matriarch of this amazing family. Of course, she should be there in the center. Well, guess what? She didn't even attend the coronation of her son. So this is definitely revisionist history and really reinforces the propagandistic power of this particular image. From the beginning of his career, Napoleon exploited the propagandistic value of art. He was not born into power like the French kings before him, nor was he elected. He was a general who had seized power in a coup d'etat. Therefore, the need to assert his legitimacy as a ruler was paramount and ever-present, and that need underlies all Napoleonic imagery produced during the empire. And I can't emphasize that enough as you're going through the exhibition, to keep this in mind, why it was so important that Napoleon was literally out there in as many ways as his image could be out there. And he's really out there with this one. With the onset of the empire in 1804, Gérard was confronted with a sudden demand for portraits fueled by Napoleon's dynastic ambitions. On the eve of the coronation, Talleyrand, Napoleon's Minister of Foreign Affairs, commissioned Gérard to paint a portrait of Napoleon in his coronation robes. This portrait was intended for the audience room in Talleyrand's official residence in Paris, so a very shrewd political move on Talleyrand's part as well. I mean, everybody is playing power games with imagery here. While Gérard was at work on the portrait in December 1804, the Minister of Interior commissioned a series of copies in different formats, and these copies were intended for members of the imperial family and court, as well as to be disseminated throughout the empire as diplomatic gifts. So it might seem like a rather overwhelming prospect for Gérard to have to come up with all of these portraits. Fortunately, he had already painted Bonaparte when he was still first consul, and as a record of his appearance, he had recourse to this portrait bust, which was painted from life in February 1803. Bonaparte appears against a backdrop of snow-capped mountains, suggestive of his Italian campaign. A sitting with Bonaparte was a rare opportunity for an artist, as he usually refused to pose, having said, "No one knows if portraits of great men are likenesses. It suffices that genius lives." To that point, Bonaparte sat for David only once in 1797, so well before he had even become emperor. And I think that's something to keep in mind as well as you see portraits of Napoleon, that it's highly unlikely that the artist who painted that portrait was face to face with Napoleon as he was painting him. The format of Gérard's portrait borrows heavily on the tradition of royal portraiture, notably representations of the Bourbon kings, especially Hyacinthe Rigaud's seminal portrait of Louis XIV in royal ceremonial robes, painted in 1702. And you can see these two works juxtaposed next to one another in the exhibition. The king is surrounded by symbols of his divine authority, from the crown on the table beside him to the royal scepter and sword, symbolic of his military might. And just a reminder, Napoleon has no claim to the divine authority of French kings. Similarly, Napoleon is flanked by the imperial regalia, the imperial orb and hand of justice, this hand of justice, the latter a nod to no less a figure than Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, after whom Napoleon styled himself. And if you had attended Napoleon's coronation in 1804 in Notre Dame, you would have entered and passed larger-than-life-size figures of Charlemagne, just in case the references and the allusions would have otherwise been lost on you. No subtlety. Napoleon is dressed in grand coronation costume, sporting the Legion of Honor around his neck. His ermine-edged velvet imperial mantle is embroidered with gold bees, symbolic of the power and prestige of the new empire, rather than the fleur-de-lis of the French monarchy. And those bees were another nod to Charlemagne's iconography. But I gather that in Charlemagne's era, they weren't really supposed to be bees, they were cicadas, but somehow it got misinterpreted and became bees instead. And you can see all those bees. Like his Bourbon predecessor, Napoleon was not a tall man, but his placement on a dais allows him to look down from high, so to speak, on his subjects. We see him at closer range as he stands before us in a setting evocative of the throne room of the Tuileries Palace, the seat of the empire. Its window is reflected in the imperial orb. As I mentioned, Gérard's portrait served as the prototype for numerous variations, usually offered as gifts by the imperial household, including this tapestry version woven between 1808 and 1811 at Gobelin, the imperial tapestry works. It was made on the orders of the emperor himself, attesting to the success of Gérard's image. It was also adapted to different formats, such as this bust-length oval painted by the artist's workshop and still in its original frame. Of course, Gérard was not the only artist to try his hand at painting imperial power, and I can't resist showing you a less successful effort. Right? Something just is off. This is a sketch for a now lost painting by Gérard's master, David, realized in 1805. Destined for Genoa, David's work so displeased Napoleon that he canceled the commission, writing, "The portrait is so bad, so filled with flaws, that I cannot accept it at all, and I do not want to send it to any town, above all in Italy, where it would give a very poor idea of our school." So in other words, he didn't feel that it was up to snuff to represent France in Italy and French art. How embarrassing for David, Napoleon's newly named first painter. While we can only speculate as to the reasons Napoleon rejected the portrait, and those reasons may have been political as well as aesthetic, to my eyes, the figure of Napoleon lacks a sense of monumentality and appears diminished by his surroundings and the trappings of his rule. Here I can't help but think of the emperor's new clothes in every sense. The success of Gérard's portrait of Napoleon launched the artist into the imperial orbit. In early 1806, Napoleon asked Gérard to paint a portrait of the empress in coronation dress as a pendant to his own imperial image. He also named Gérard first painter to the empress in the same year. Gérard's portrait was exhibited to great acclaim at the Salon of 1808. Critics lauded the work for its likeness, the naturalism of the pose, and the rendering of the various fabrics, from the rich velvet and ermine robes to the silk dress, richly embroidered in gold. But of course, what were the critics supposed to do? Say that it was a terrible portrait? I mean, that wouldn't have flown in the empire either. So, this portrait served as her official image. And here, it's worth noting that only 6 years separate Gérard's portraits of Josephine. So that gives you a sense of how rapidly the political situation in France changed, where within a 6-year span, Josephine could move from being private citizen at home in her living room to the Empress of the French. So quite a transformation. In 1806, Napoleon named his favorite brother Louis King of Holland. Isn't that nice that that's just showed what he could do? Oh, I'll make you King of Holland. I'll make you King of Spain. So that's what happens when you're emperor. Although Gérard painted this portrait before Louis became king, this imposing work nonetheless establishes his authority. He wears the costume of a prince of France. His hand rests on a sword, which, together with the plumed helmet, signal his honorary status as Constable of France, and this makes him second in command to his brother. The seated pose is unusual among Gérard's male portraits. This may have been done to accommodate the sitter's gout. Even at this early date of the empire, Gérard shows himself to be a master of representing its pomp, from the costumes to the furnishings and the symbolic accoutrements of power. In June 1808, In June 1808, Napoleon's older brother Joseph was made King of Spain by imperial decree. In other words, by his little brother. Joseph commissioned this imposing portrait from Gérard, who spares no detail in capturing the trappings of his authority. Note especially the gold-embroidered lines of Leon and the towers of Castile, which symbolize Spain, and you can see them all over the velvet robes, and the chain and sash of the Spanish Order of the Golden Fleece, which dates back to the 15th century, so it's no parvenu order like the newly minted Legion of Honor. The throne, with the large J emblazoned on its back, was Gérard's invention. And by the way, the portrait gives no sign that this new title for Joseph was effectively a demotion, because he had completely failed as being King of Naples. So Napoleon gave that to a different brother and just made Joseph King of Spain. Consolation prize. The sitter's hand-on-hip pose may look familiar to you. Gérard again borrowed from Rigaud's portrait of Louis XIV to embody the new imperial authority, transferring the pose from the Bourbon king to Napoleon and his court. And we will see variations of this pose recur in his imperial portraits. Case in point, this portrait of Napoleon's youngest brother, Jérôme, named king of the newly created Kingdom of Westphalia in 1807. Like his older brothers, Jérôme turned to Gérard to craft his official image, which hews very closely to Napoleon's portrait in imperial costume. Unlike the emperor, Jérôme had been neither consecrated nor crowned, so the imperial regalia in this instance are merely props, devoid of any real significance, so that orb and the crown, the hand of justice, meaningless props. The Paris Salon of 1808 featured some 20 portraits of Napoleon's extended family, portrayed by different artists. David's monumental painting of the coronation was also on view, and together the ensemble of these Napoleonic works served as a potent reminder of the role of portraiture in disseminating imperial propaganda. 1808 also marks Gérard's return to the public forum of the Salon after a 6-year hiatus, which one critic blamed on the demand for his portraits among rich collectors, leaving the artist, and I quote, too little leisure to occupy himself with other works. In other words, history paintings. In this view of the Salon, Napoleon presents the great history painter David with the Legion of Honor. And David deferentially bows his head to Napoleon. And I'm not sure if Gérard is among the artists that are shown in this sketch, but I suspect he would likely have been there for this tribute to his teacher. And returning now to Gérard, his portrait of Empress Josephine, at left, figured among a constellation of portraits of members of the imperial family and their court that he exhibited in 1808, works that, in the judgment of one critic, were made to enhance his reputation. Also on view was the portrait of Hortense de Beauharnais, Queen of Holland, and her second son, the Prince Royal, which you can see on the right. It was commissioned by Napoleon in 1806 for a gallery of princesses planned for the Tuileries Palace. The distant landscape, a view of the North Sea dominated by a cloud-streaked sky, evokes Dutch prototypes. The setting also serves as a reminder of the extent of Napoleon's empire. Not incidentally, Hortense de Beauharnais was Josephine's daughter from her first marriage and married to Napoleon's brother, Louis, so keeping it in the family, so to speak. While Josephine and Napoleon were conspicuously childless, this portrait of mother and son in 1808 sent a reassuring message of dynastic continuity, that whole idea of an heir and a spare. You're covered. Gérard's elaborate portrait of Napoleon's youngest sister, Caroline Murat, the newly anointed Queen of Naples, surrounded by her 4 children, amplifies the message of dynastic fecundity throughout the empire. And recall at the beginning of my talk, we saw her with 2 of her children, and now they've doubled in number. The setting is the Kingdom of Naples. Note the smoking Mount Vesuvius glimpsed through the open window, or the open doorway. In a gesture symbolizing dynastic succession, Caroline clasps the hand of her oldest son and heir to the throne. Gérard's portrait cleverly evokes the absent Napoleon as patriarch of the imperial dynasty. The oldest child at left appears in the type of military uniform worn by his uncle, while the oldest daughter at right, the little girl that we saw in the cradle in the beginning, and you can see her in the exhibition clutching that bust of Napoleon, she is wearing a miniature around her neck with a pendant that bears, and the pendant miniature is a portrait of Napoleon in the same uniform that the little boy is wearing. Thereby, Gérard associates the childless emperor with this familial and, by extension, dynastic ideal. He also painted a more intimate portrait of the Queen of Naples. This marks the last of 5 portraits that he painted of Caroline Murat between 1801 and 1815. In it, she is seated before a view of the Bay of Naples. Her black dress highlights the fair complexion for which she was renowned. The head-on view allows Gérard to capture her velvety gaze, as the sitter's youngest daughter later described it in her memoirs. Its format recalls Gérard's earlier portrait of Madame Regnault de Saint-Jean d'Angély, which was exhibited in the Salon of 1799. And the compositions of both of these works suggest the influence of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, which was then housed in Versailles before its move to the Louvre in 1804. And at the time, Leonardo's work was widely admired for its naturalism, and Gérard was not the only contemporary French painter to succumb to Leonardo's influence. There's a magnificent portrait by Ingres of Mademoiselle Rivière at the Louvre, which clearly shows him looking to Leonardo's Mona Lisa. Along with his portraits of the imperial family, Gérard also exhibited recently completed portraits of members of Napoleon's court at the Salon of 1808. This commanding portrait represents Michel Regnault de Saint-Jean d'Angély, the husband of the woman we just saw, who, among other imperial honors, was recently named Count of the Empire. He wears the black robes of the procurer of the High Court, as appointed by Napoleon. Its relatively austere setting contrasts with the Baroque excesses of his imperial portraits. The book and quill pen on the table might allude to the sitter's legal training and his service as Secretary of State to the imperial family. The Empire-style armchair, which recalls contemporary examples by the firm Jacob de Molterre, likely belonged to the artist, as it appears in other portraits by Gérard. Its grand, full-length format recalls the portraits of ministers and grand officers of the empire commissioned by Napoleon for the Palace of Fontainebleau. One such work is this portrait of Napoleon's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, painted by Pierre-Paul Prudhon in 1807. Talleyrand wears the red robes of the Grand Chamberlain, an office that he held from 1804 to 1809. And, lest there be any doubt as to who is in charge, a Roman-style bust of Napoleon gazes down on his Grand Chamberlain. So it's like he's going like, I'm watching you. At the Salon of 1808, the public encountered another side of Talleyrand, as captured by Gérard. The presence of this portrait in the midst of Gérard's official imperial portraits in the public forum of the Salon exhibition must have been somewhat startling in 1808, given that Talleyrand had resigned from his position as Minister of Foreign Affairs the year before in a dispute over Napoleon's expansionist foreign policy. The choice to be represented as a private citizen at home, so to speak, was likely Talleyrand's. Yet, the work is not devoid of political content. Most conspicuously, the silver insignia of the Legion of Honor and its attendant red sash, which had been awarded to Talleyrand in 1805 by Napoleon. And there's also a bust of the emperor in this portrait, but it's much harder to find than in the other portrait by Proudhon. And we know that it's Napoleon because there's an inscription at its base, but it's reflected in a mirrored door behind the sitter, almost completely obscured by the door frame and portiere. So it's back there, and it's, I think, a bit hard to see, but take my word for it, it's there. And its inconspicuous placement is perhaps suggestive of Talleyrand's ambivalence toward Napoleon. In turn, Napoleon once publicly called Talleyrand, quote, a shit in a silk stocking. And isn't that a great insult? Just before he relieved Talleyrand of his honorific title of Grand Chamberlain. Talleyrand, though, retained the title of Prince de Bénévent, which had been given to him by the emperor in 1806, and it was under that title that his portrait was listed in the Salon Catalogue in 1808. And Gérard captured Talleyrand's notorious inscrutability, as a Salon commentator slyly observed that the artist, quote, could not have chosen a more suitable expression for the most skillful diplomat of our time. And another contemporary, lauding Gérard, observed, quote, above all, the portrait of Monsieur de Talleyrand makes him a painter of the characters as much as the appearance of his models. And if you read memoirs of the period and descriptions, repeatedly people comment on how hard Talleyrand was to read, and Napoleon himself similarly complained that he never knew what Talleyrand was thinking. And I suppose that's a very good skill to have if you're a diplomat or a wheeler-dealer, and as Talleyrand was. The imperial familial ideal that Gérard and other artists promoted at the Salon of 1808 was irrevocably altered the following year. In December 1809, Napoleon divorced Josephine, who had failed to provide the empire with its requisite heir. Enter Marie-Louise, daughter of Emperor Francis I of Austria, and Austria was conveniently a political ally of France. Gérard, the former first painter to Empress Josephine, was enlisted to produce the official portrait of the new empress. In this portrait, intended as a pendant to that of Napoleon, Marie-Louise appears to have just risen from her throne in the Tuileries, over which her imperial mantle is artfully draped. The stool beside the throne, on which the imperial regalia is displayed in the emperor's portrait, is here conspicuously empty, underscoring that Marie-Louise rules as a consort rather than as a titled sovereign. Once again, Gérard unleashed a tour de force of bravura brushwork in rendering the various fabrics of her imperial costume: velvet, ermine, satin, and lavish gold embroidery. For her likeness, Gérard probably turned to this bust, which he had painted from life, as he had done for his portrait of Napoleon. As you can see, Gérard focused in the portrait study at right on her features, which are brought to a higher degree of finish than the rest of the work. And a mirror would have allowed him to record its obverse in the full-length portrait. You can see her head is turned the other way there. By the time Gérard's portrait of the new empress was exhibited in the Salon of 1812, Marie-Louise had already given birth to a son, thereby ensuring the future of the new dynasty. And in 1812, Gérard painted this portrait of the infant Napoleon, named after his father and given the very hefty title, King of Rome. This is no ordinary infant. He wears the red sash of the Legion of Honor. His chubby left hand rests on an orb, not a rattle, emblematic of imperial power, while his other hand clutches a rattle as if it were, in fact, the imperial scepter. The tricolor palette of blue, white, and red is likely not coincidental. By imperial decree order of the same year, these colors were adopted for the flags of Napoleon's army, and we are meant to see this little child as the future commander of that army. Multiple copies of this portrait were made by the artist and his studio, but the fate of one especially resonates in light of the power of images during the empire. And there are so many portraits of this little baby in the exhibition that some of them are rather quite amusing in their portrayals. But at the Empress's request, Gérard painted two versions of the portrait we just saw. One exhibited at the Salon of 1812, while the other was delivered to Napoleon in Russia on the eve of the Battle of Moscow as a surprise gift from his wife. And in the days before FedEx, it took 37 days for that portrait to make it to Napoleon in Moscow. According to one account, Napoleon immediately displayed his son's portrait in front of his tent, as you see here, inviting his officers and generals to see it. And just to the left of Napoleon is General Marat. And the proud father deemed Gérard's work a masterpiece. Unfortunately, during the army's retreat from Moscow, the portrait that so pleased the emperor was destroyed along with other baggage due to a lack of horses to transport the defeated army and its supplies. This small oil sketch commemorating the event was painted in 1813 by a young Horace Vernet, who probably offered it as a gift to Gérard. And Gérard kept this work until his death in 1837, and you can see this little sketch in the exhibition. In 1813, Marie-Louise commissioned this life-size portrait from Gérard, who once again rose to the occasion. The Empress presents the heir to the throne to his subjects, as it were. The child wears what looks like diapers and the red sash of the Legion of Honor, and holds a pomegranate, an attribute symbolizing the unity of the state. Gérard's composition also recalls Renaissance images of the Virgin Mary and Christ child, in which the fruit symbolizes the Passion of Christ. Like the Christ child, the King of Rome is nearly nude, his pose equally dynamic and more adult than childlike. Such parallels were doubtless intended and meant to flatter. Napoleon, who was not known for his connoisseurship skills, commented that the satin dress of the Empress looked wet. While such official portraits dominated Gérard's work as a portraitist during the Empire, he also realized more private family portraits. And this, of course, is one of the real showstoppers in the exhibition. In 1814, Gérard painted this monumental portrait of the Duchess of Montebello out for a stroll with her 5 children in a setting evocative of the family's estate outside of Paris. The Duchess served as Lady of Honor to Marie-Louise. She had been chosen by Napoleon himself. However, her distaste for court life was well known. As a contemporary later recalled, after her husband's death, she found her sole happiness in bringing up her children and in the beloved company of her family and a few friends. Her husband, Marshal Jean Lannes, was fatally wounded by a cannonball in 1809 during Napoleon's Austrian campaign. The partially visible statue it left is presumably a monument to the fallen hero, identified by a cannonball at its foot. I could not identify a statue of Lannes made before 1814, the date of this painting, which suggests, to me at least, that the artist invented it as a means to evoke the family's patriarch. To that point, the gaze of the oldest son, dressed in a military-inspired ensemble, another echo of his father, directs our attention to the statue. The statue of Lannes honors his heroic sacrifice on the field of battle in a portrait that celebrates familial harmony as a tribute to the family's patriarch. The work's outdoor setting and air of informal elegance evoke recent precedents in British portraiture, which Gérard admired. In particular, Gérard knew the British portraitist Thomas Lawrence, corresponded with him, and when Lawrence would visit Paris in 1825, Gérard would host Lawrence for an intimate dinner at his house outside of Paris. This was painted in 1814. Now, spoiler alert, the empire collapsed in April 1814, and things did not end well for Napoleon, who died in exile in St. Helena in 1821. However, Gérard's brush with power did not end with the fall of Napoleon. He went on to serve the newly restored Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, painting him in his coronation robes in 1814. He would do the same for his successor, Charles X, in 1825, seen here. And finally, the citizen king, Louis Philippe, painted in 1831. But none of Napoleon's successors would harness the power of the brush as a means for self-promotion as effectively as he had done. The portraits that Gérard painted in service of the imperial agenda represent the culminating expression of his brush with power. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And as Amy said, I'm happy to answer any questions, or do my best to answer any questions that you might have.
If there's any questions, please raise your hand and I will walk down to you so you can speak into the mic. Oh. Sir?
You said that Gérard did not have face-to-face sittings with most of his subjects?
No, what I meant to say was, and I hope I said, was that Gérard had limited face time with Napoleon. He only did one sketch study from life of Napoleon, just Napoleon. This was the case of Napoleon, who didn't like to pose for artists and was not available. But he would have sittings with his other portrait subjects.
Okay.
Just not Napoleon.
Thank you.
Sure, sure. You know, when you're busy being, seizing power and fighting battles and running an empire, it's tough to find time to pose for a portraitist.
We saw many wonderful portraits, and he was a very prolific artist. Are they preponderantly in French museums? Is there any concentration of where his work is assembled?
You're absolutely right. In fact, most of Gérard's portraits are in France, at Versailles, a large number, Fontainebleau, the Louvre. We at the Met the Met happens to have two portraits by Gérard, the Talleyrand portrait and a portrait of his wife. The portrait of the Duchess of Montebello, this spectacular full-length portrait, is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. But really to see, especially the full-length and the imperial ones, you really have to take a little field trip to Paris, which I strongly recommend.
Any other questions? Oh, perfect. I'll be right over there. Here you go.
So basically, he was painting all of his Napoleon in these glamorous robes. Did he ever paint anything that was more realistic, like Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, or?
Certainly Napoleon, no, he didn't. I mean, when you're propaganda, that really kind of counters the whole notion of what propaganda is for, right? So, no, he did not. And Napoleon, to your point though, David painted a portrait of an ancient general, Leonidas. This got made into a movie, I think, The 100 or something like that.
300,
Leonidas
yeah.
at Thermopylae, yes?
Yeah.
Napoleon hated that painting because it was the image of a general who would be defeated. Napoleon didn't like anything to do with loss and defeat. So no images of a defeated Napoleon painted by Gérard.
Thank you.
Sure, I think there's a question here. You're welcome. Oh, Gérard, I'll repeat that since the mic didn't make it down. He did paint some of the Allied monarchs, especially in that kind of tenuous period between 1814, 1815, when a lot of the European monarchs did come to France, like Tsar Alexander of Russia, and so on. Yes, Gérard did paint them too in his studio. And one of Gérard's first biographer in 1847 wrote something like, in a single day, Gérard was said to have painted 3 different sovereigns. And by the way, Gérard did not make house calls. They came to his studio. He did not go to them.
So did the paintings, for example, Tsar Alexander, did the paintings go back to St. Petersburg, or where were they?
I think that one might still be in Russia. But sometimes they got, sent around. It depended who was in power where and who was related to whom, and they sent around these imperial portraits.
I have a question. If Napoleon was such a master at propaganda, did he leave the composition of the painting to the painter, or did he have some influence in that?
I wish I could see you in the dark, but wherever you are, that's a very, very good question. And largely what artists like Gérard and David relied on were other artistic prototypes. And as I said earlier, Napoleon wasn't much of a connoisseur, and I've never come across any direction where he said, oh, there's one where Napoleon specified, but there is one, and I don't have it in the talk because it's by David, but not Gérard. Do you know the image? There's this image of Napoleon when he's still a general crossing the Alps, and he's on this rearing horse, and his jacket is billowing in the wind. Do you know that one? Well, that, in real life, Napoleon crossed the Alps on a donkey, not on a horse. And it was supposedly, so you talk about revisionist history, and it was supposedly Napoleon who requested that, or when he was Bonaparte, requested that he be portrayed calm on a fiery steed. So that's one instance of his intervention in the composition of a portrait. A donkey, come on. Yes.
In the greater scheme of things,
ma'am.
You said that Gérard
Can you
was a
repeat it
student
in
of David. In the greater scheme of these two painters, did Gérard surpass Jacques-Louis David in your view, or in the view, I realize that ultimately Gérard is producing portraits for Napoleon. What's your...
Well, that's an excellent question, and I can give you a specific example. Both Gérard and David painted this society beauty. She was like a Kardashian, okay? She was a salon hostess too. I don't think the Kardashians host salons, but her name was Juliette. She was Juliette Récamier, and she was renowned for her beauty. And there's an unfinished portrait of her at the Louvre, painted by David around 1800, and for whatever reason, he couldn't resolve it. But she then turned to Gérard, who painted her portrait in 1804, finished it, and it now hangs in the Musée Carnavalet in Paris. So that was a case where the artist turned to, where the sitter turned to the student. And in terms of portraiture, some of their contemporaries thought that Gérard had exceeded David as a portraitist, or at least perhaps might have been more flattering, which is, of course, what everybody wanted and still wants, more flattering. So that's a great question. They're kind of maybe frenemies.
Could you talk a little bit about how they got paid?
How they got paid? Well, they did get paid. I don't have... Actually, Gérard's ledgers note payment that he received for works, but people did pay him. I think these kinds of imperial portraits would have been paid for by the government as opposed to by Bonaparte himself. But they did get paid.
Here you go. Thank you.
If people came to Gérard, this was different than Winterhalter or de Laszlo, correct? The people, as I understand it, Winterhalter and de Laszlo would have gone to the court. But I think I understood you to say that the sitter would go to Gérard.
That's true. I mean,
Okay.
I can't speak for Winterhalter's practice as portraitist, and that's, later in the 19th century, but it's documented that for Gérard, the people largely came to him, and there's, a letter where he tells one sitter, oh, there's another Gérard in San Francisco, a double portrait of a mother and daughter, and he writes to the mother, to the woman, could you please bring this chair to my studio, because he wanted to have that chair be in this double portrait. So we know people were going to him in his studio. So I don't know, I know for his practice that that's how he did it.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm just curious, how did he charge people? I know he got paid. Did he charge by the hour? Did they just gift him money? How did that work?
Well, I know that there were actually documented, and I can't remember the amounts, but there were specific fees that he would charge for a portrait, and the fee depended on the format of the portrait. So if it was a bust-length format, like just to here, that was cheaper than if you went, full length, and I'm sure a multi-figure group portrait would cost even more. And by this date, too, I should add that Gérard, like many artists, had a studio with assistants. So on this, you can't count on the fact that every single stroke of paint was laid down by Gérard himself. He would have had studio assistants helping him with it, too. But of course, always reserving the right to put on the finishing touches. And this is actually described by his primary assistant was a woman, and she described what his practice was like in working for him in the studio, and that's how, in part, how we know so much about it, because they were then, her accounts of Gérard's practice as portraitist were published in the later 19th century. So that's how we know how he did things.
You described over and over that a lot of these portraits were debuted at the Salon in Paris. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about the role of the Salon. Were there different levels of painters that would be part of this expo in the Salon? And also, was it part of the propaganda? Was it all political, or how was the Salon set up?
I should have, that's a good question, and I should have explained the Salon. The Salon was a venue, a state-sponsored, government-sponsored art exhibition held in Paris since the 17th. It originated in the 17th century, and it had a kind of hiatus, and then it resumed with regularity, either yearly or every other year in the 18th century, before it kind of petered out at the end of the 19th century. To get an artist to get his, or sometimes her, but usually his or her work in the Salon, the art had to be reviewed by a jury, and that jury was comprised of members of the Academy of Painting and Sculpture. And it was really, until the late 19th century, the only way an artist could get his or her reputation made and be seen publicly. And this is particularly significant in the later 19th century, when artists like Manet, Courbet, and then the Impressionists are trying to get their work into the Salon and often being rejected. And it was those rejections and artistic differences that led the artists who became the Impressionists to splinter off in 1874 and have their own exhibition in the studio of the photographer Nadar in Paris. So that's vestiges of the Salon and its jury, which by then was becoming increasingly rigid and rejecting artists. Does that help?
We have time for one more question, if anyone has anything. Oh.
Not a question, but talking about artists being paid. I haven't worked on Gérard, but I have worked on Baron Gros, and he was paid 4,000 francs for a full-length portrait. For for painting for the Gallery of Diana, where you had a historical scene, those typically went for 12,000 francs, which was a very good price because the director of the Louvre, Vivant Denon, that was his annual salary. So it gives you some idea of what salaries, of what costs were. The David's coronation of Napoleon, that he was paid 65,000 francs for that. Partly out of a mistake, they paid him 5,000 francs a month until he completed it. And after 13 months, someone said, hey, wait a minute, we've shelled out all this money and you haven't completed it yet. And they cut off the price. He wanted 100,000 francs because he said, I get 1,000 francs for a portrait head and there are 100 portraits in the painting.
Well, that seems reasonable.
And as to how they were paid, you had your painting delivered. You were then sent a letter saying the painting was accepted, and take this letter to the cashier's office, the Imperial cashier's office, and they will pay you.
Right. Well, now that you say that, Anne, that's really useful and great to know. Gérard, in terms of the hierarchy of payment, look, all Gérard wanted, he painted these great portraits, but he still wanted to be a history painter. And so he would, to try to discourage commissions, make the price for his portraits higher and charge less for the history paintings, because he really wanted to do more history paintings than portraiture, but he fell into the trap, so to speak, of being a portraitist, and this is what we're left with. I think, luckily for us, but perhaps not really what he most wanted to do.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.